Young Maya Chen sits in the back of a police car, tears streaming down her face as Officer Rodriguez dismisses her desperate pleas. "My mom will come for me," she whispers, but he just laughs mockingly. "Sure, kid, and I suppose she's some kind of superhero too." Maya mentions her mother is in special forces, which only makes the officer laugh harder. "Listen, little girl, stop making up stories. Your mom probably works at some desk job and has no idea you're even missing." What Officer Rodriguez doesn't know is that Maya's mother, Colonel Sarah Chen, is currently leading an elite military operation just 20 miles away. When she receives the emergency alert about her daughter, she immediately mobilizes her team. What happened next left everyone speechless. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Riverside Park as 15-year-old Maya Chen sat quietly on a weathered bench, her worn backpack resting beside her small frame. She glanced at her phone for the third time in 10 minutes, knowing her mother, Colonel Sarah Chen, would arrive soon to pick her up from her after-school tutoring session. Maya preferred this quiet spot near the military base where they lived, away from the chaos of the main school pickup area. Her simple outfit of faded jeans and an oversized gray hoodie helped her blend into the background, which was exactly how she liked it. The park bordered the edge of Fort Braxton, and Maya could see the familiar sight of military vehicles in the distance, a reminder of the world she knew so well. She was reviewing her chemistry homework when raised voices caught her attention from behind a cluster of oak trees. 3 older teenagers were huddled together, their conversation growing increasingly heated. Maya tried to focus on her studies, but the tension in their voices made it impossible to ignore. Suddenly, one of the teens shouted and shoved another, sending a small package flying through the air. The contents scattered across the grass as all 3 boys began yelling accusations at each other. Maya recognized what she was seeing from the drug awareness programs at school, and her instinct was to quietly gather her things and move away from the situation. However, before she could stand, the sound of screeching tires filled the air as 2 police cruisers pulled up to the park entrance. The teenage boys immediately scattered in different directions, leaving behind the evidence of their interrupted transaction. Maya remained seated, hoping the officers would handle the situation without noticing her, but her location on the bench put her directly in their line of sight. Officer Rodriguez emerged from the first vehicle, his 15 years on the force evident in his weathered face and the cynical set of his shoulders. Budget cuts had been hitting the department hard lately, and his promised promotion had been delayed indefinitely, leaving him bitter about his stagnant career. He surveyed the scene with practiced eyes, noting the scattered pills and the young Asian girl sitting nearby with her backpack. To Rodriguez, it was an open and shut case of kids dealing drugs in the park, and Maya's proximity made her an obvious suspect. Her simple clothes and quiet demeanor fit his mental profile of troubled youth from the area, and he approached her with the assumption that she was involved in whatever had just transpired. Maya looked up as the officer's shadow fell across her homework, her dark eyes wide with confusion and growing concern as she realized she was about to become part of something she had nothing to do with. Officer Rodriguez stood over her with his hand resting on his belt, his expression already forming the judgment that would change everything about this seemingly ordinary afternoon. The fluorescent lights of Pine Valley Police Station cast a harsh glare across the linoleum floors as Officer Rodriguez escorted Maya through the front doors, his firm grip on her shoulder making it clear she wasn't there by choice. Maya had tried explaining during the car ride that she was simply waiting for her mother to pick her up from tutoring, that she had nothing to do with whatever those other teenagers were doing in the park, but Rodriguez had dismissed her words with a wave of his hand and a muttered comment about kids always having excuses. Now, as they walked past the front desk where other officers barely looked up from their paperwork, Maya felt the weight of being completely misunderstood by someone who held all the power in this situation. Rodriguez guided her toward a holding area that contained several plastic chairs bolted to the floor, where 3 other teenagers already sat waiting. There was Marcus, 16 and wearing a torn leather jacket, who had been caught shoplifting at the mall, and Jessica, 15 with multiple piercings and bright purple hair, brought in for vandalism, and Danny, 17 in a stained basketball jersey, arrested for disturbing the peace outside a convenience store. Maya's faded jeans and oversized gray hoodie, which had seemed perfectly normal at home that morning, now made her appear to belong with this group of actual troublemakers in Rodriguez's eyes. He looked at her sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap, her homework still clutched in one hand, and saw only another delinquent, who probably came from a broken home with absent parents who didn't care enough to keep track of their child. Rodriguez had seen it all before during his 15 years on the force. Or at least he thought he had. And Maya's polite demeanor struck him as nothing more than an act designed to manipulate the system. He began lecturing her about responsibility and consequences, his voice carrying the tone of someone who believed he was dispensing wisdom to youth who desperately needed guidance. Maya listened respectfully, occasionally saying, "Yes, sir," or "I understand," but every few minutes she would politely interrupt to ask if she could please call her mother, explaining that Colonel Chen would be worried when Maya didn't show up at their agreed pickup location. Rodriguez would roll his eyes at what he perceived as fantasy stories about her mother's military rank, telling Maya that lying would only make her situation worse and that she needed to start taking responsibility for her actions instead of making up elaborate tales about her family background. Maya's quiet persistence in maintaining her story only reinforced Rodriguez's belief that she was a troubled kid who lived in a world of delusions, and he continued his lecture about how kids these days had no respect for authority, while Maya sat patiently, checking the clock on the wall and knowing that her mother would soon discover she was missing. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms as Maya politely asked for the fourth time if she could call her mother, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious stress of her situation. "Let me guess," he said with a condescending smirk. "She's working late at her very important job and doesn't have time to keep track of where her daughter is running around." Maya straightened her shoulders slightly, the way her mother had taught her to do when facing adversity, and replied in her quiet but clear voice that Colonel Maya Chen was currently conducting a nighttime tactical training exercise approximately 20 miles north of their location at Fort Braxton. The words hung in the air for a moment before Rodriguez burst into loud laughter, the sound echoing off the concrete walls of the holding area and causing the other detained teenagers to look up from their own misery. "Colonel Maya Chen," Rodriguez repeated in a mocking tone, drawing out each syllable as if it were the punchline to an elaborate joke. He turned to Officer Martinez, who was passing by with a stack of paperwork, and called out, "Hey Martinez, come listen to this kid's story about her mom, the Colonel," his voice dripping with sarcasm and amusement. Maya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as Rodriguez continued his performance for his colleague. But she maintained her composure and simply repeated that her mother was indeed a colonel in the United States Army Special Forces, and that she would be expecting Maya to be home for dinner at 1800 hours. This only made Rodriguez laugh harder, and he began embellishing the story for Martinez's benefit, suggesting that maybe Maya's mother was also a secret agent, or perhaps an astronaut on the side. "These kids today," Rodriguez said, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. "They'll say anything to avoid taking responsibility for their actions, even make up elaborate fantasies about their parents having important careers." He turned back to Maya with a cruel smile and suggested that her real mother was probably working a double shift at some minimum wage job and had no idea her daughter was out dealing drugs in parks, which was why Maya had invented this fictional military mother to make herself feel more important. Maya's jaw tightened slightly, the first sign of real emotion she had shown since arriving at the station. But her voice remained steady as she explained that lying about her mother's service would be disrespectful to all the men and women who serve their country with honor. Rodriguez waved dismissively at her words and told her to save the patriotic speeches for someone who might believe them, then suggested that Maya's elaborate lies were probably a sign of deeper psychological problems that came from growing up in an unstable household, where children had to create fantasy parents to cope with abandonment and neglect. Maya Chen sat with her back straight against the hard plastic chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap as Officer Rodriguez continued his relentless verbal assault, each cruel word designed to break down what he perceived as her stubborn refusal to admit her guilt and abandon her fictional stories about her family. Despite the public humiliation and the snickers from some of the other officers who had gathered to witness Rodriguez's performance, Maya's composure never wavered, her mother's training and dignity under pressure serving her well in this moment of crisis. She glanced at the institutional clock on the wall, noting that it was now 4:30 in the afternoon, which meant her mother would be expecting her call check-in within the next hour, as they had arranged that morning over breakfast. Rodriguez noticed her looking at the clock and launched into another round of mockery, suggesting that Maya was probably waiting for her imaginary Colonel Mother to swoop in and rescue her from the consequences of her criminal behavior, his voice getting louder and more theatrical with each passing minute. "Let me tell you something, little girl," Rodriguez said, leaning forward in his chair so his face was uncomfortably close to Maya's. "Your mother probably took off years ago because she couldn't handle raising a delinquent kid, and now you're stuck making up fairy tales about military heroes because the truth is too painful to accept." Maya's dark eyes never left his face as she absorbed his words. But she didn't flinch, or cry, or give him the emotional reaction he seemed to be trying to provoke, instead simply stating in her calm, clear voice that her mother had never abandoned her and never would. Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably near the water cooler, exchanging glances with Officer Thompson, who had paused in his paperwork to watch the interaction, both men beginning to feel that Rodriguez was taking his interrogation tactics too far, with what appeared to be a respectful and well-mannered child. Thompson cleared his throat and suggested that maybe they should just process the girl and move on to more pressing cases, but Rodriguez waved him off with the authority that came from being the senior officer on the evening shift, reminding everyone present that he had 15 years of experience dealing with juvenile delinquents and knew how to handle kids who thought they could manipulate the system with sob stories and elaborate fantasies. Maya waited for a brief pause in Rodriguez's monologue before speaking in the same polite tone she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, asking if she could please exercise her right to make one phone call, as she was certain that clearing up this misunderstanding would only require a brief conversation with her mother, who could verify her identity and explain why Maya had been at the park. Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, surprised by her continued politeness and formal way of speaking, then shrugged and said he supposed even delusional kids were entitled to their phone calls, especially when it would prove once and for all that their stories were nothing but desperate lies. Rodriguez escorted Maya to the desk phone with exaggerated ceremony, making a show of rolling his eyes as he lifted the receiver and held it out to her with obvious reluctance, his body language broadcasting to everyone in the station that he was humoring a delusional child who was about to be exposed as a liar. He positioned himself directly behind Maya's chair, close enough that she could feel his breath on the back of her neck, and announced loudly enough for the other officers to hear that he would be monitoring the call to ensure she didn't try to coach whoever answered into playing along with her elaborate military fantasy. Maya accepted the phone with quiet dignity, her small fingers steady as she dialed the emergency contact number she had memorized years ago, the special line her mother had given her for situations that couldn't wait for regular communication channels. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before switching to an automated voicemail system with a generic military recording that provided no personal information about the account holder, exactly as it was designed to do for operational security purposes. Rodriguez smirked triumphantly at the sound of the impersonal message, already preparing his victory speech about kids who called random numbers and pretended they belonged to their fictional parents, but Maya's expression remained calm and focused as she waited for the beep. "Hello, Mom. This is Maya," she began in the same clear, respectful tone she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "I am currently being held at the Pine Valley Police Station on suspicion of drug-related activities that occurred at Riverside Park at approximately 15:45 hours today. I was not involved in any illegal activities and was simply waiting for our scheduled pickup time when I witnessed an incident involving other individuals. I am unharmed and being treated according to standard procedures, but I believe there has been a misunderstanding about my involvement that requires your attention. The officer in charge is Rodriguez, badge number 4729, and I am requesting that you contact the station as soon as possible to verify my identity and provide clarification about my whereabouts this afternoon. I will remain cooperative with all lawful instructions until you arrive. Thank you." She hung up the phone and folded her hands in her lap, looking up at Rodriguez with the same patient expression she had worn throughout their entire interaction. Rodriguez stared at her for a moment, caught off guard by the professional tone and specific details she had included in her message, then quickly recovered his mocking demeanor and announced to the room that Maya had just left a message for nobody, probably some disconnected number she had memorized to make her performance more convincing. "Nice try, kid," he said with a condescending pat on her shoulder. "But calling random voicemail boxes doesn't prove your imaginary military mom exists, so why don't you try again and call someone real this time? Maybe the foster parents who are probably wondering where their troubled kid disappeared to." 20 miles north of Pine Valley, in the dense pine forests surrounding Fort Braxton, Colonel Maya Chen crouched behind a fallen log as she coordinated the final phase of a complex nighttime infiltration exercise with her 12-member Special Forces unit. The sounds of simulated gunfire and tactical radio chatter filled the air around her as Alpha Team moved into position for their assault on the mock enemy compound, their movements precise and coordinated after months of training under Sarah's demanding leadership. At 38 years old, Sarah had earned her reputation as one of the most brilliant tactical minds in the Special Forces community. Her ability to analyze complex battlefield scenarios and develop innovative solutions had made her a sought-after instructor for the military's most challenging operations. Her soldiers respected her not just for her strategic expertise, but for her unwavering commitment to bringing every member of her team home safely, a dedication that had earned her 3 commendations for valor and the absolute loyalty of everyone who served under her command. The current exercise was designed to test her unit's ability to adapt to changing conditions in hostile territory, and Sarah had spent weeks developing scenarios that would push her soldiers to their limits while maintaining the highest safety standards. She glanced at her tactical watch, noting that the exercise was running exactly on schedule. When Sergeant Williams approached her position with the encrypted communication device that connected her to base operations, "Colonel, we have a 15-minute break while Bravo team repositions for the next phase," he reported quietly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the continuing simulation around them. Sarah nodded and took the opportunity to check her emergency messages, a routine she followed religiously, even during the most intensive training operations, because her responsibility as a single mother never took a break, no matter what military duties demanded her attention. She activated her secure phone and saw that she had one new message on her emergency line, the number she had given Maya to use only in situations that couldn't wait for their regular communication schedule. The moment she heard her daughter's calm, measured voice explaining her situation at the Pine Valley police station, Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins, and every instinct she had developed as both a mother and a military officer screamed that this was not a routine misunderstanding that could be resolved with a simple phone call. Maya's use of precise military time, her careful recitation of details, and most importantly, the underlying tension Sarah could detect beneath her daughter's controlled tone, told her everything she needed to know about the seriousness of the situation. Sarah's mind immediately shifted from training mode to crisis response, her years of experience in high-stakes operations allowing her to process the information and begin formulating a response plan, even as she felt the cold fury of a mother whose child was in danger building in her chest like a gathering storm. Maya Chen's transformation was instantaneous and absolute, her maternal concern crystallizing into the cold, focused intensity that had made her legendary among Special Forces operators across multiple theaters of operation. She stood from her position behind the fallen log with fluid precision, her mind already shifting into the tactical planning mode that had carried her through missions in Afghanistan, Syria, and classified operations that would never appear in any official record. "Williams?" she called to her second-in-command, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority that made seasoned soldiers snap to attention even in the middle of complex training scenarios. "I need you to assume command of the exercise immediately and continue with Phase 3 as planned." Sergeant Major Williams, a 20-year veteran who had served with Sarah through 3 combat deployments, recognized the shift in his colonel's demeanor and responded with crisp professionalism, asking no questions about the sudden change in leadership, even as he wondered what could possibly require Sarah's immediate attention during such a critical training operation. Sarah pulled him aside and briefed him with military efficiency, explaining that she had a family emergency that required her immediate departure from the training area, and that he should continue the exercise exactly as planned until she could return or send word through proper channels. The other members of Sarah's unit, scattered throughout the forest in their tactical positions, began to notice the change in radio traffic and the sudden urgency in their colonel's movements as she gathered her personal equipment and prepared to leave the field. These were soldiers who had witnessed Sarah's calm leadership under enemy fire in Kandahar, who had seen her make life-and-death decisions in Syrian villages while mortar rounds exploded around their position, who had followed her through the most dangerous missions the military could devise, but none of them had ever seen this particular expression on their colonel's face. There was something different about the way she moved now. A predatory focus that went beyond even her legendary battlefield intensity, as if every principle of military tactics and every lesson learned in hostile territories was being channeled toward a single, critical objective. Sarah's reputation in the Special Forces community was built on successful missions that others had deemed impossible, operations where her strategic brilliance and uncompromising dedication to her soldiers had turned potential disasters into textbook victories that were studied at military academies around the world. She had earned the respect of generals and admirals, had been personally commended by the Secretary of Defense, and had turned down promotion opportunities that would have taken her away from active duty with her teams, but all of that seemed insignificant compared to the mission she was undertaking now. As she moved toward the extraction point where her vehicle waited, Sarah was no longer just a decorated military officer responding to a training scenario. She was a mother whose child was in danger, armed with all the skills and resources that the United States military had spent 15 years teaching her to use. Back at Pine Valley Police Station, Officer Rodriguez was basking in what he perceived as his complete victory over Maya's elaborate deception, pacing back and forth in front of her chair like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments to a jury. He was certain he had already convinced. He had made a show of calling Lincoln High School to verify Maya's enrollment and alleged tutoring session. But the automated system had simply informed him that the main office was closed until the following morning, which Rodriguez interpreted as further proof that Maya's entire story was fabricated from beginning to end. When Officer Martinez tentatively suggested that they could access military personnel databases to verify whether a Colonel Maya Chen actually existed at Fort Braxton, Rodriguez waved him off with the dismissive authority of someone who refused to waste departmental resources on what he considered an obvious fraud. "Listen, Martinez," Rodriguez said loud enough for Maya to hear every word. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I know a troubled kid spinning fantasies when I see one. So we're not going to waste taxpayer money running database searches for imaginary military parents." Maya remained seated with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Rodriguez's shoulder, drawing on the inner strength her mother had taught her to cultivate during difficult situations. She knew with absolute certainty that Colonel Maya Chen never broke a promise, especially promises made to her daughter. And Sarah had promised many years ago that she would always come when Maya needed her, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. This unshakable faith in her mother's word gave Maya the composure to endure Rodriguez's increasingly vicious commentary about her supposed family situation, his words designed to break down her defenses and force her to admit what he believed was the truth about her background. Rodriguez began speculating aloud about Maya's real living situation, suggesting that she probably bounced between foster homes or lived with relatives who didn't want the responsibility of raising someone else's problem child, his voice taking on the cruel tone of someone who enjoyed having power over those who couldn't fight back. "You know what I think happened here?" Rodriguez announced to the room, his performance clearly intended to humiliate Maya in front of the other detained teenagers and any officers within earshot. "I think this kid's real parents dumped her somewhere and took off. And now she's created this whole fantasy about having a military mom because the truth is too painful to face." Maya's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign that Rodriguez's words were having any impact, but her voice remained steady and respectful when she quietly stated that her mother had never abandoned her and never would, regardless of what Officer Rodriguez chose to believe. This only fueled Rodriguez's determination to break what he saw as her stubborn refusal to accept reality, and he continued his verbal assault with increasingly personal attacks about deadbeat parents and the psychological damage that abandonment inflicted on children who then retreated into elaborate fantasy worlds to cope with trauma. Officer Martinez had been watching the interaction between Rodriguez and Maya for the past hour with growing unease, his 3 years on the force having taught him to recognize the difference between genuinely troubled youth and kids who simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maya's consistently respectful demeanor, her precise way of speaking, and her complete lack of the defensive anger or emotional manipulation tactics that Martinez had come to expect from repeat juvenile offenders struck him as fundamentally different from the profile Rodriguez was trying to force her into. During his training at the police academy, Martinez had learned that truly delinquent teenagers typically responded to authority with either aggressive defiance or calculated charm designed to manipulate the system. But Maya displayed neither of these behaviors, instead maintaining a quiet dignity that seemed almost military in its discipline and composure. When Rodriguez paused his verbal assault to answer a phone call from dispatch, Martinez approached Maya's chair and quietly asked if she needed water or if she was feeling okay, noting that she had been sitting in the same position for over an hour without complaint. Maya thanked him politely and assured him that she was fine, then asked if he might be able to verify her mother's military service through official channels, her tone suggesting that she understood the bureaucratic process and wasn't simply hoping someone would believe her story without evidence. Martinez glanced back at Rodriguez, who was still occupied with his phone call, then leaned closer to Maya and asked her to repeat her mother's full name and unit assignment, his pen poised over a notepad as he prepared to write down the information. Colonel Maya Chen, United States Army Special Forces, currently assigned to Fort Braxton. Maya replied with the same precise clarity she had maintained throughout her ordeal, then added her mother's service number and the emergency contact protocol she had used earlier. Martinez felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Maya's knowledge of military procedures and terminology was far too detailed and accurate for someone who was simply making up stories, and he quickly walked to the computer terminal to begin running the searches that Rodriguez had dismissed as unnecessary. When Rodriguez finished his phone call and noticed Martinez at the computer, his face darkened with the kind of anger that came from having his authority questioned by a subordinate officer, and he strode across the room with obvious irritation. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Martinez?" Rodriguez demanded, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone whose ego felt threatened by the possibility that his judgment might be questioned. Martinez straightened his shoulders and explained that he was simply conducting routine verification procedures to confirm the identity of a minor in custody. But Rodriguez slammed his hand down on the desk and ordered him to step away from the computer immediately. The tension in the station became palpable as other officers noticed the confrontation, and Martinez realized that Rodriguez's stubborn refusal to investigate Maya's claims might be driven by pride rather than professional judgment, creating a dangerous situation that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Sarah's black military SUV led a convoy of 3 vehicles through the quiet streets of Pine Valley as the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the suburban landscape that seemed almost peaceful compared to the storm of controlled fury building in the colonel's chest. She had changed from her tactical field gear into her dress uniform during the 20-minute drive from Fort Braxton, the dark blue fabric adorned with ribbons and medals that told the story of 15 years spent in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, each decoration representing missions where her strategic brilliance and unwavering courage had saved American lives and advanced national security interests. The Combat Infantryman badge gleamed on her chest alongside the Bronze Star Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, and the Army Commendation Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, while her Special Forces tab and Ranger tab announced her membership in the military's most elite communities to anyone who understood what they were looking at. Sarah had made the decision to wear her full dress uniform rather than civilian clothes because she wanted there to be no doubt about who she was or what authority she carried when she walked into that police station, and every element of her appearance was calculated to command immediate respect and establish her credibility beyond any possible question. Staff Sergeant Williams and Corporal Thompson remained in the trailing vehicles at her explicit instruction, their presence serving as backup support while making it clear that this was a personal matter that she intended to handle with her own authority rather than as a military operation. Sarah's mind raced through multiple scenarios as they approached the police station, her training in crisis management and tactical planning automatically generating contingency responses for every possible situation she might encounter inside that building. She had dealt with corrupt officials in Afghanistan, incompetent bureaucrats in Iraq, and hostile foreign military officers in classified operations around the world, but nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for the unique challenge of facing someone who had mistreated her daughter while believing they could do so without consequences. The protective instincts of a mother were combining with the strategic mindset of a special forces officer in ways that Sarah had never experienced before, creating a focused intensity that felt both familiar and completely new as she prepared to enter what might become the most important mission of her career. As the convoy pulled into the parking lot of Pine Valley Police Station, Sarah took a deep breath and centered herself the way she had before countless dangerous operations, knowing that she needed to maintain perfect control over her emotions and her actions if she was going to effectively protect Maya and resolve this situation without creating additional problems. She was prepared for any level of confrontation that might be necessary, from polite diplomatic discussions to the kind of decisive action that had made her reputation in hostile territories, but her preference was to handle this with the minimum force required to ensure her daughter's safety and dignity were restored. The desk phone at Pine Valley Police Station rang with sharp urgency, cutting through the routine evening chatter as Sergeant Davies answered with his standard greeting, only to be met by the crisp, professional voice of Staff Sergeant Williams, requesting immediate access to the facility for Colonel Maya Chen, who needed to speak with the officer in charge regarding a detained minor. Davies straightened in his chair as he recognized the unmistakable authority in the caller's voice, the kind of military bearing that demanded respect even through a telephone conversation, and he quickly informed Williams that he would notify the duty supervisor immediately. Rodriguez overheard the conversation from across the room where he had been continuing his verbal assault on Maya, and his expression darkened with the familiar irritation he felt whenever the military personnel from Fort Braxton seemed to think their authority extended beyond the boundaries of their base. "Great, just what we need," Rodriguez muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear, his voice dripping with the resentment that had been building over years of what he perceived as the military's arrogant assumption that they could interfere with local law enforcement operations. He had dealt with military police before when soldiers got into trouble in town, and he had always resented their professional demeanor and their tendency to handle situations with efficiency that made his own department look disorganized by comparison. Rodriguez was already preparing his speech about jurisdictional boundaries and the independence of civilian law enforcement when the front doors of the station opened with a quiet authority that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the building. Colonel Maya Chen stepped through the entrance with a kind of presence that made conversation stop and heads turn, her dress uniform immaculate, and her bearing radiating the confidence of someone who had commanded respect in war zones and diplomatic situations around the world. Every ribbon and medal on her chest caught the fluorescent light as she moved, creating a display of military achievement that was impossible to ignore or dismiss, while her calm, focused expression suggested someone who was completely in control of both herself and the situation she was walking into. Officer Thompson looked up from his paperwork and felt his mouth go dry as he recognized the insignia of a full colonel, realizing that whoever had requested this meeting was not some junior military bureaucrat, but a senior officer whose authority extended far beyond anything they typically dealt with in their small-town police station. Detective Harrison paused in the middle of filling out a report as he noticed the way Sarah carried herself, the fluid movement and alert awareness that marked her as someone who had seen combat and survived situations that would break most people. Even the detained teenagers in the holding area stopped their whispered conversations as they sensed the shift in the room's energy, some primitive instinct, recognizing that someone dangerous had just entered their environment, though whether that danger was directed at them or someone else remained to be seen. Rodriguez turned from his position near Maya's chair to see what had caused the sudden silence, and the smug expression on his face began to falter as he took in the full impact of Colonel Maya Chen's presence, his mind struggling to process the possibility that the fantasy military mother he had been mocking for the past 2 hours might actually be standing 10 feet away from him in full dress uniform. Colonel Maya Chen moved through the police station with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to entering hostile environments, her polished black dress shoes clicking against the linoleum floor in a steady rhythm that seemed to announce her arrival to every person in the building. Her spine was perfectly straight, her shoulders squared with the kind of military bearing that had been drilled into her through years of training and reinforced by countless high-stakes missions where projecting confidence could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. The overhead fluorescent lights caught the polished metal of her insignia and decorations, creating small flashes of silver and gold that drew attention to the combat infantryman badge, the Bronze Star Medal, and the distinctive Special Forces tab that marked her as a member of the military's most elite community. Sarah approached the front desk with deliberate steps, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the station's layout and the positions of all personnel, with the automatic situational awareness that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. Sergeant Davies looked up from his paperwork as she approached, and his expression immediately shifted from routine boredom to respectful attention as he recognized the full colonel's eagles on her uniform and the array of ribbons that spoke to extensive combat experience and leadership under fire. "Good evening, Sergeant," Sarah said in a voice that carried absolute authority while remaining perfectly controlled and professional. "I am Colonel Maya Chen, United States Army Special Forces, and I am here to see my daughter, Maya Chen, who I understand is currently being detained at this facility." The words were delivered with the kind of calm certainty that made it clear she expected immediate cooperation, not because she was making demands, but because the situation was so obviously legitimate that any delay would be unreasonable. Davies felt his training kick in as he recognized that he was dealing with a senior military officer whose authority and credibility were beyond question, and he immediately began pulling up the intake records on his computer, while explaining that he would locate the appropriate personnel to assist her. The sound of their conversation carried across the station's open floor plan, and Rodriguez noticed the sudden shift in activity around the front desk, along with the unmistakable sight of a military dress uniform that seemed completely out of place in their small-town police environment. Curiosity overrode his irritation as he moved away from Maya's position to investigate what kind of military business could possibly require a colonel's personal attention at their modest facility, his mind still completely disconnected from the possibility that this imposing figure in dress blues could have any connection to the quiet teenager he had been tormenting for the past several hours. As Rodriguez approached the front desk, Sarah turned slightly to acknowledge his presence, and for the first time since entering the building, her expression showed a hint of the controlled intensity that lay beneath her professional demeanor, like a storm gathering strength behind a calm facade. The moment Officer Rodriguez's eyes met Colonel Maya Chen's steady gaze, every drop of blood seemed to drain from his face as the full magnitude of his catastrophic error crashed down on him like a collapsing building. His 15 years of police experience suddenly feeling worthless in the face of what he had just done to the daughter of a decorated Special Forces officer. Sarah's dress uniform was like a roadmap of military achievement that Rodriguez could read all too well. His own brief stint in the Army National Guard 20 years ago, having taught him enough to recognize the significance of the Combat Infantryman Badge, the Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor, and the distinctive green beret flash that marked her as one of the military's most elite warriors. The Special Forces tab above her name tape was not something that could be faked or purchased at a surplus store, and Rodriguez knew that earning it required surviving some of the most grueling training the military had to offer, followed by deployments to places where most people would not last a single day. Sarah's calm, professional demeanor somehow made Rodriguez's earlier mockery seem even more appalling in retrospect, his cruel jokes about Maya's imaginary military mom now echoing in his memory like accusations of incompetence and stupidity that would follow him for the rest of his career. The contrast between Sarah's quiet dignity and his own loud bullying behavior was so stark that Rodriguez felt physically sick as he realized that every word he had spoken, every sneer he had directed at Maya, had been witnessed by other officers who would remember this moment for years to come. "I would like to speak privately with whoever is responsible for my daughter's detention," Sarah said in a voice that carried the kind of absolute authority that made grown men snap to attention. Her words delivered with the controlled precision of someone who had commanded soldiers in life-and-death situations and knew exactly how to communicate when the stakes were high. Rodriguez opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out as he struggled to process the reality that the quiet, respectful teenager he had been systematically humiliating was actually the daughter of a woman who had earned the right to wear decorations that most soldiers could only dream of achieving. His mind raced through the previous 2 hours, recalling every cruel comment, every mocking laugh, every dismissive wave of his hand, and he realized that his career in law enforcement was probably over before Maya Chen even opened her mouth to file what would undoubtedly be a devastating complaint about his conduct. The other officers in the station had stopped their conversations and were watching the interaction with the kind of fascinated horror that people display when witnessing a car accident, and Rodriguez could feel their eyes on him as he stood frozen in place, knowing that his reputation and his future had just been destroyed by his own arrogance and his refusal to take a 15-year-old girl seriously when she told him the truth about her family. Colonel Maya Chen accepted the detention paperwork from Sergeant Davies with the same methodical precision she had used to review intelligence reports in hostile territories, her dark eyes scanning every line of Rodriguez's hastily scrawled documentation while Officer Rodriguez stood beside her desk. His earlier swagger completely evaporated as he attempted to explain his actions through a series of increasingly desperate and contradictory statements. Sarah's expression remained perfectly neutral as she listened to Rodriguez's stammering justification for detaining Maya without proper cause, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to construct a narrative that would make his behavior seem reasonable to someone whose military training had taught her to identify lies and incompetence with surgical accuracy. "You state here that my daughter was apprehended in connection with suspected drug activity," Sarah said in a voice that carried the kind of clinical detachment she had used when interrogating enemy combatants, her finger pointing to a specific line in Rodriguez's report, while her eyes never left his face. "Yet your own documentation shows no physical evidence linking her to any illegal substances, no witnesses placing her with the actual suspects, and no Miranda warning given before you began questioning a minor without parental consent." Rodriguez's face grew even paler as Sarah methodically dismantled his case with the kind of logical precision that had made her legendary among military intelligence officers, each of her observations delivered with the calm authority of someone who had spent years learning how to expose flaws in hostile testimony. The other officers in the station had gathered at a respectful distance to watch the interaction, their expressions ranging from professional fascination to barely concealed horror as they witnessed Rodriguez's complete loss of control under Sarah's relentless but perfectly polite questioning. Detective Harrison exchanged glances with Officer Martinez, both men recognizing that they were watching a master class in interrogation techniques as Sarah used Rodriguez's own words and documentation to build an unassailable case against his professional conduct. "Furthermore," Sarah continued without raising her voice or changing her expression, "your report indicates that you refused to verify my daughter's identity through official channels, despite her providing specific military contact information that could have resolved this situation within minutes, suggesting either gross negligence or deliberate misconduct on your part." Rodriguez tried to interrupt with another explanation about following standard procedures and dealing with uncooperative juveniles, but Sarah's steady gaze and slight raise of her hand silenced him as effectively as a direct command from a superior officer. The watching officers could see Rodriguez's authority and credibility crumbling in real time as Sarah exposed every gap in his logic, every procedural violation, and every moment where his personal bias had overridden his professional judgment, her military training in psychological warfare serving her well as she systematically destroyed his position without ever losing her composure or resorting to the kind of emotional outbursts that Rodriguez had used to intimidate Maya. Sergeant Davies escorted Maya from the holding area toward the front desk where her mother waited. And the moment Sarah saw her daughter approaching, the carefully maintained professional mask she had worn throughout her confrontation with Rodriguez developed hairline cracks that revealed the fierce maternal protectiveness burning beneath her military composure. Maya walked with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her ordeal, her worn jeans and oversized hoodie looking even more humble in contrast to her mother's immaculate dress uniform. But her dark eyes lit up with unmistakable relief as she recognized the familiar figure who had come to rescue her from this nightmare. Sarah opened her arms, and Maya stepped into the embrace without hesitation, the reunion silent but profound as the colonel's hands moved automatically to check her daughter for any signs of injury or mistreatment, her fingers gently touching Maya's face and arms with the kind of systematic assessment she had learned during combat medical training. "Are you hurt?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice dropping to the gentle tone she reserved exclusively for her daughter, temporarily setting aside her role as a military officer to focus entirely on her responsibilities as a mother. Maya shook her head and assured her mother that she was physically fine, then quietly thanked Sarah for coming so quickly, her words carrying the absolute trust and confidence that came from 15 years of knowing that Colonel Maya Chen never failed to keep her promises, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. The brief moment of tenderness between mother and daughter seemed to illuminate the contrast between Maya's inherent dignity and Rodriguez's crude assumptions about her character, making his earlier behavior appear even more reprehensible to the officers who were watching the reunion with growing discomfort about their colleague's conduct. Sarah's attention returned to Rodriguez with laser focus as he cleared his throat and attempted to regain some measure of authority by explaining that his actions had been based on reasonable assumptions about Maya's background and behavior, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone who knew he was losing an argument but refused to accept responsibility for his mistakes. Sarah said with icy precision as she positioned herself slightly between Maya and the man who had spent hours tormenting her daughter. "Are you seriously attempting to justify your unprofessional conduct by suggesting that my daughter's appearance gave you permission to ignore proper procedures and deny her basic rights?" Rodriguez's face flushed as he realized how his words sounded when reflected back to him by someone whose authority far exceeded his own. But his pride and desperation drove him to continue digging his professional grave by suggesting that Maya's simple clothing and quiet demeanor had naturally led him to conclude that she came from an unstable home environment where parents were typically absent or uninvolved in their children's lives. Completely unaware that his assumptions were only making Sarah's case against him stronger with every word he spoke, Sarah's response came with the measured precision of a sniper taking aim, her voice remaining perfectly controlled, even as her words cut through Rodriguez's justifications with surgical accuracy that left no room for misinterpretation or further excuses. "Officer Rodriguez, the young woman you have been systematically humiliating for the past 2 hours maintains a 4.0 grade point average, volunteers at the base hospital every weekend, speaks 3 languages fluently, and has been accepted to West Point for early admission based on her academic excellence and leadership potential," Sarah said, each achievement delivered like evidence in a court-martial, as she methodically dismantled every assumption Rodriguez had made about Maya's character and background. The watching officers exchanged glances of growing horror as they realized the magnitude of Rodriguez's error, understanding that he had not simply mistreated a random teenager but had targeted the daughter of a decorated war hero, a child whose achievements and character were the exact opposite of everything he had accused her of being. Sarah continued her devastating assessment with the same clinical detachment she had used to brief generals on battlefield casualties, explaining that Maya's understanding of military protocols and procedures came from years of living on military bases around the world, where she had learned to conduct herself with the kind of dignity and respect that Rodriguez seemed incapable of showing to anyone he perceived as beneath his authority. "Your behavior this evening reflects not only on your personal character but on the entire Pine Valley Police Department," Sarah stated with the kind of quiet authority that had made enemy commanders surrender without firing a shot. "And I find it deeply disturbing that an officer with 15 years of experience would choose to abuse his position by tormenting a child rather than following basic investigative procedures that would have resolved this situation in minutes." The impact of Sarah's words was immediately visible in the faces of the other officers, who were beginning to understand that Rodriguez's conduct could potentially result in lawsuits, media attention, and departmental investigations that would affect everyone's career and reputation. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the station as Captain Morrison burst through the front doors, his civilian clothes hastily thrown over pajamas, and his expression showing the kind of panic that came from being awakened by a phone call, informing him that one of his officers was being confronted by a Special Forces colonel who was threatening to file formal complaints about police misconduct. Morrison's eyes took in the scene with growing alarm as he observed Rodriguez's pale, sweating face, the rigid posture of the uniformed colonel, whose chest displayed more combat decorations than most soldiers would see in a lifetime, and the quiet teenager who was standing beside her mother with the kind of composed dignity that made Rodriguez's earlier descriptions of her seem utterly ridiculous. The captain realized immediately that he was walking into a potential public relations disaster that could destroy careers and damage the department's reputation for years to come, and his first instinct was to begin the kind of damage control that might salvage something from Rodriguez's catastrophic failure of judgment. Captain Morrison's assessment of the situation took less than 30 seconds. His 25 years of law enforcement experience allowing him to recognize a career-ending disaster when he saw one, and he immediately stepped forward with the kind of damage control instincts that had saved his department from previous public relations nightmares. "Colonel Chen, I am Captain Morrison, and on behalf of the entire Pine Valley Police Department, I want to offer our most sincere apologies for the completely unacceptable treatment you and your daughter have received tonight, he began, his voice carrying the genuine remorse of someone who understood that his officer's conduct had not only harmed two innocent people, but had potentially exposed the department to lawsuits, media scrutiny, and federal investigations that could destroy careers and reputations. Sarah acknowledged his apology with a slight nod, but maintained the rigid military bearing that made it clear she was not interested in empty gestures or superficial responses to what had been a systematic abuse of power. Her dark eyes never leaving Morrison's face as she evaluated his sincerity and his commitment to addressing the underlying problems that had allowed Rodriguez's behavior to continue unchecked. Rodriguez stood frozen beside his captain, the full weight of his situation finally penetrating his consciousness as he realized that his 15-year career was probably over. His pension was in jeopardy, and his reputation in the law enforcement community would never recover from being publicly humiliated by a decorated Special Forces officer whose authority and credibility were unquestionable. "Captain Morrison," Sarah said with the same measured professionalism she had used in diplomatic negotiations with foreign military leaders, "while I appreciate your apology, my primary concern is ensuring that no other child experiences what my daughter endured tonight," which suggests that Officer Rodriguez's conduct may be symptomatic of broader systemic issues within your department that require immediate attention and comprehensive reform. Her words carried the implicit threat that she was prepared to take this matter to higher authorities if necessary, but they also offered Morrison an opportunity to address the situation internally before it became a federal case study in police misconduct. Morrison immediately assured Sarah that Rodriguez would face appropriate disciplinary action and that the department would review all policies and procedures related to juvenile detention, his tone making it clear that he understood the gravity of the situation and was committed to preventing future incidents. Sarah's expression remained neutral as she listened to his promises, but her military training in negotiation and conflict resolution allowed her to recognize genuine commitment when she heard it, and she began to shift from confrontation mode to problem-solving mode as she considered how to transform this incident into an opportunity for meaningful change. Officer Rodriguez's behavior was not simply unprofessional, Sarah stated with quiet finality. It was a fundamental violation of the trust that citizens place in law enforcement. And while I have no interest in destroying his career for personal satisfaction, I will not allow this incident to be swept under the rug or dismissed as a simple misunderstanding that can be resolved with a reprimand and sensitivity training. Captain Morrison wasted no time implementing immediate consequences for Rodriguez's conduct, informing him in front of Sarah and the assembled officers that he was suspended without pay, pending a full internal investigation, and that his badge and service weapon would be confiscated before he left the building that evening. Rodriguez's hands shook as he removed his badge from his uniform shirt, the metallic click of it hitting Morrison's palm seeming to echo through the station like a funeral bell for his career in law enforcement, while his fellow officers watched with expressions ranging from professional sympathy to barely concealed relief that his toxic behavior had finally caught up with him. Within 48 hours of the incident, Rodriguez's treatment of Maya had become required reading at the police academy as an example of how personal bias and assumptions could lead to catastrophic failures in judgment, and his case was being studied by police departments across 3 states as they examined their own procedures for handling juvenile detentions. Sarah met with Morrison and the department's training coordinator over the following weeks to develop new protocols that would prevent similar incidents, her approach methodical and collaborative rather than punitive, focusing on creating systemic changes that would protect all children rather than simply punishing one officer for his failures. The new procedures she helped design required officers to verify the identity of detained minors within 30 minutes of arrival at the station, mandated that all juvenile questioning be recorded for review, and established clear guidelines for when parental notification was required, regardless of the suspected offense. Sarah's military background in training and development proved invaluable as she worked with the department to create scenarios and role-playing exercises that would help officers recognize their own biases and assumptions before they affected their professional judgment, her goal being to transform the culture of the department rather than simply adding new rules to an existing system. Rodriguez, meanwhile, found himself enrolled in mandatory sensitivity training and community service programs designed to help him understand the impact of his behavior on the people he was supposed to serve and protect, his participation being closely monitored by both the department and the court system as part of his path toward possible reinstatement. Sarah made it clear during her discussions with Morrison that her primary objective was preventing future Maya Chens from experiencing what her daughter had endured, and that she was willing to work constructively with anyone who shared that goal, regardless of their role in the original incident. The protocols Sarah helped establish were eventually adopted by police departments throughout the region, and her approach became a model for how military and civilian law enforcement could collaborate to improve community relations and protect vulnerable populations. Rodriguez's case served as a powerful reminder to officers throughout the department that their authority came with responsibilities that extended far beyond their own careers and comfort, and that the consequences of abusing that authority could extend far beyond disciplinary action to include fundamental changes in how they were allowed to do their jobs. 6 months after the incident that nearly destroyed his career, Officer Rodriguez walked through the doors of Pine Valley Police Station with a fundamentally different perspective on his role as a law enforcement officer. His mandatory sensitivity training and 200 hours of community service having forced him to confront the ugly reality of his own biases and the harm they could inflict on innocent people. The training had been humbling and often painful, requiring him to examine his assumptions about race, class, and family structure while working alongside social workers, educators, and community leaders who helped him understand how his behavior had perpetuated harmful stereotypes that damaged police-community relations. His community service had been spent tutoring at-risk youth at the local community center, where he discovered that many of the teenagers he had automatically labeled as troublemakers were actually dealing with challenges that would have broken adults, and that their respectful behavior toward him, despite his reputation, had taught him more about dignity and character than 15 years of police work had managed to do. Rodriguez now approached every interaction with citizens by consciously checking his initial assumptions, asking himself whether his judgments were based on evidence or prejudice, and treating every person with the same respect he would want his own family members to receive from law enforcement officers. Meanwhile, Maya Chen had not only maintained her perfect grade point average, but had also been selected as her class valedictorian and had received early acceptance to West Point, where she planned to follow her mother's path into military service with a focus on military intelligence and strategic planning. The experience at the police station had strengthened rather than weakened her resolve to serve her country, and she often spoke about how witnessing both the abuse of authority and its proper use had taught her valuable lessons about leadership and the responsibility that came with power over others. Maya had also become an advocate for juvenile rights in her community, working with local organizations to educate young people about their legal protections and speaking at school assemblies about the importance of remaining calm and respectful when dealing with law enforcement, even when facing unjust treatment. The Pine Valley Police Department had implemented comprehensive training protocols based on Sarah's recommendations, including mandatory bias awareness training for all officers, new procedures for verifying the identity of detained minors, and regular community engagement programs designed to build positive relationships between police and the families they served. Captain Morrison had made these reforms a cornerstone of his leadership, using the department's transformation as an example of how law enforcement agencies could learn from their mistakes and emerge stronger and more effective. The new protocols had already prevented several potential incidents similar to Maya's case, and other departments throughout the region had adopted similar programs after seeing the positive results in Pine Valley, creating a ripple effect of reform that extended far beyond the original incident that had sparked the changes. The transformation that occurred in Pine Valley over those 6 months served as a powerful reminder that true change happens not through punishment or revenge, but through the courage to confront our own biases and the determination to build something better from the wreckage of our mistakes. Maya and Sarah's relationship had grown even stronger through their shared experience, with Maya gaining a deeper appreciation for her mother's strength and wisdom, while Sarah discovered new depths of pride in her daughter's grace under pressure and her commitment to using their ordeal as a catalyst for positive change in their community. Officer Rodriguez had become one of the department's most effective advocates for fair and respectful treatment of all citizens, his personal journey from prejudice to understanding, making him uniquely qualified to help other officers recognize and overcome their own assumptions about the people they served. The lessons learned from that terrible evening at the police station had spread far beyond the walls of one small-town department, touching the lives of countless families who would never know how close they had come to experiencing similar injustice before the reforms prevented it from happening. Maya's story demonstrated that appearances can be deceiving in ways that go far beyond simple clothing or economic status, revealing that true character is measured not by what someone wears or where they come from, but by how they conduct themselves when facing adversity and how they treat others who have less power than they do. Sarah's response to the crisis showed that real strength lies not in dominating or humiliating those who have wronged us, but in using our authority and influence to create systemic changes that protect the vulnerable and prevent future victims from suffering unnecessarily. The Pine Valley Police Department's transformation proved that institutions can learn from their failures and emerge more effective and more trusted than they were before, but only when leaders have the courage to acknowledge problems and the wisdom to implement meaningful solutions rather than superficial fixes. Rodriguez's journey from arrogant bully to thoughtful public servant illustrated that people can change when they are held accountable for their actions and given the tools and support they need to grow beyond their limitations and prejudices. Most importantly, the entire experience reinforced the fundamental truth that respect cannot be demanded or assumed based on titles or uniforms, but must be earned through consistent actions that demonstrate genuine care for the welfare and dignity of others. As Maya prepared to begin her journey to West Point and Sarah continued her service to her country, they carried with them the knowledge that they had not only survived a difficult trial, but had used it to make their community stronger and more just for everyone who would come after them. Their story stands as a testament to the power of dignity in the face of injustice, the importance of standing up for what is right even when it is difficult, and the transformative potential that exists when people choose to build bridges rather than walls in response to conflict and misunderstanding.